I think it's time to get started. So sorry, Raj, I'm gonna. No. How's it? Mustafa, is that good? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Sites of Aesthetic Resistance, a panel discussion with artist Raj Kamal Kalan. Sorry, I'm gonna take my mask off my ear. I want to welcome everyone, both here in person in the gallery and also those of you that are Suzette Men, Heidy Sarabia, Maria Elena Vargas, and moderator Elaine O'Brien. This event today is in collaboration with the Center for Race, Immigration, and Social Justice here at Sacramento State, known as CRISJ. CRISJ works for the empowerment of communities that have suffered historical and continuous systemic oppression. The organization actively works to advance critical knowledge and amplify empathy towards marginalized communities. They are an amazing organization here on campus, so I encourage you to watch out for some of their programming that will be forthcoming this year. And Still I Rise would not have been possible without our partner, Yuba Sutter Arts and Culture in Marysville, California, and support from the California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. There will be another event on Friday, this Friday, October 8th, from 6 to 8 p.m. up in Yuba City at the Sutter Theater Center for the Arts, where Raj Kamal will also be participating in another panel discussion with some community members from Yuba City and Marysville. So I invite you, if you're wanting to take a drive up to Yuba City or live close by, to come join us for that event as well. There is a corollary or complementary exhibition in their space that has some similar works, but also an expanded look at Raj Kamal's work at their venue. So special thanks to the artist for being here with us in person today, all the way from Germany. She has been participating in numerous events here on campus, and we are incredibly lucky to have her here with us. I also want to thank all the panelists for coming out today. My numerous student gallery assistants who have helped set up both the exhibition and several of our events. Ben Hunt, who is our preparator, did amazing work in our installation, and special thanks to Mustafa Shaheen, who is the gallery's coordinator, and much, much more, as he's doing all the technical work, especially with those of you who are able to watch virtually today. So please join me in welcoming and starting our presentation with our artist. Oh, sorry, I want to actually introduce Elaine O'Brien, the moderator for our event today, who will be introducing the artists and the panelists. Off to you.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. I guess the sound is all right. I've already been reassured of that. Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody here and watching. I'm excited to hear what everyone is going to say, and I think everybody is. I also want to thank Kelly for making all these things happen, for this wonderful show, and for bringing Raj Kamal Kalan here. It's just a real wonderful opportunity for us at Sac State. And it's extremely relevant to what we're all thinking about today. I also get to introduce Raj. It's a real privilege. She is the creator of the compelling art around us in both these galleries. And it represents 20 years of her production. And one of the things I'm sure that struck you, as it has me, is that in all that time, 2 decades, she's really been consistently focused on this it's sort of a passionate project, is how I see it, but also in her formal strategies. And I'm a historian of modern and contemporary art, and I've been teaching it for like 2 decades here at Sac State. So of course my focus is on the art of the formal qualities, including the formal qualities of the text. But I'm not going, that's my focus. We have a specialist here, in immigration and border situations, violence, from sociology and ethnic studies. It's going to be really a rich, I think, conversation. As Kelly said, dive into it. And we also have Suzette Men, who brings a broad perspective from art history as well, but also curatorial studies. And she's done a lot of work in related fields and political perspectives on Asian American art and Asian art. So I'm going to introduce the panelists after I introduce Raj. And then Raj is going to talk for about 30 minutes. After that, I'll introduce the panelists. I'll give you more idea of where they're coming from, their points of view, and then they will each respond to her art and how it's relevant to their research and their concerns with teaching and research. But for Raj, let me give you what I've written here. So the consistency of it is what I've been looking at in terms of its content, but also its formal strategies. I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about that, but some of you may want to ask about it. So this afternoon, her talk, she's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and her focus will be on the subject of this panel, which is art as sites of resistance, especially her art as sites of resistance. Originally from Northern California, born in Auburn in 1974, Raj Kamal Kalan has been based in Berlin, Germany, and recently accepted a position as a professor of painting at the University of Fine Arts in Hamburg, Germany. She earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of California, Davis, and a Master of Fine Arts in Painting and Drawing from the California College of Arts in the Bay Area. CCA, as we call it here. Kalan is an alumna of Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. Her work has been exhibited internationally in Taipei, Antwerp, Warsaw, Mexico City, Vienna, Berlin, and Memmingen, Germany, and now Sacramento. We're really in a distinguished lineup here. She is the recipient of numerous awards, grants, and residencies, including the 2019 Villa Romana Prize, the Joan Mitchell Painting and Sculpture Award, Pollock Krasner Award, and the 2021 Hans and Leah Grundig Prize. So we are going to, we've scheduled the panel, the talk and the panel to leave about 15 minutes for you all to ask questions or comments, just engage with us at the end. So there will be time, and maybe during the panel you could just take notes. I'm always wanting students and people to take notes towards your what you want to contribute to this conversation. We're eager to hear from you. So, okay, Raj, you could.
Okay, so I'm gonna actually remove my mask while I talk, and then I think each of us will remove our masks during our speaking. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you, and thank you for the Kelly and my co-participants today for meeting to have this discussion. I feel very honored. So I'm gonna just put up my first slide and leave that up for a minute. So my name is Raj Kamal Kalan, as you know. I was born in the US and I've lived in Berlin since 2010. My parents left Punjab, India to migrate to the US in 1974. They first settled in Auburn, then Yuba City, and eventually the Bay Area. And as an artist, for the last 20 years, I've been reflecting on how history and its traces in the form of archives are important sources of information for understanding our present world, one that is highly unequal, genocidal, and on the verge of environmental collapse. The technoscientist Donna Haraway poses the question slightly differently. She asked, what does it mean to act and write in an age of extermination and extinction? And what is the work of recuperation? For me, part of that answer lies in a prologue written by David Stannard in his book, American Holocaust. So I'm going to paraphrase him here. On an early summer morning in 1945, the first atomic bomb was exploded at a test site named after the Holy Trinity in the sands of New Mexico. 4.5 centuries earlier, in 1492, Columbus landed at San Salvador. Both of these moments represented culminations of technological achievement, and both instances set off an orgy of human destruction that each in their own way attained a level of devastation that was never before witnessed in the entire history of the world. He goes on to describe that 21 days after that test at Trinity, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killing at least 130,000 people in one explosion. 21 years after Columbus landed in the Caribbean, the vastly populated island that he renamed Hispaniola was desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus called Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. So, in the frame of one generation then, what happened on Hispaniola was the equivalent of 50 Hiroshimas. And this was only the beginning, he writes. Terms like colonialism, migration, and refugee can often be uttered casually, disconnected from past events and firsthand experiences. For me, these terms emerge from my lived experience of migration, living in the US and now in Germany. These terms emerge from tremendous histories of violence that are central not only to my work, but also to my understanding of what it means to carry a US passport while I am allowed to live and work in Europe. Today, I'd like to focus on 3 of my most recent projects. So the first project I'd like to address is one that's here in the gallery next to you, on your right and behind you. So the project is We've Come a Long Way to Be Together. And this was a project that was first commissioned by the Research Center for Material Culture, which is headed by Wayne Modest. It's in Leiden in the Netherlands. Wayne approached me and asked if I wanted to, if I could propose a project that connected the history of European colonialism with the current, what is called the crisis of migration in Europe right now. And I very happily created a project, an idea for a project, and it was centered around a famous travel diary written by Wilfred Thesiger. So I'll just put up, so the book that he wrote in the 1950s is called Arabian Sands. It was published in a lot of different languages. Men of a certain generation internationally know this. I've met people from Israel, the Middle East, Italy, the US, and England, who all know this. And Wilfred Thesiger is still considered in heroic terms in the entire Gulf region. He was a British aristocrat and elite that traveled through Saudi Arabia and wrote this, his account of living with the Bedouin. And for me, it wasn't about the book, but rather it was more about Wilfred Thesiger as an iconic representation of a type of traveler, a type of highly privileged traveler. And I was thinking about creating a project centered around his book that created new portraits of travelers that were coming from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and tried to bring into conversation the forms of travel that exist in our world. One that is highly privileged, romanticized, and heroicized, like Wilfrid Thesiger's, and the other, the travel that is pathologized, criminalized, and feared by the refugee, by the figure of the refugee. And so I created a project by first cutting apart this book, then using the pages of this book as the sort of the surface material on which I made a photographic transfer of anthropological figures coming out of the Tropin Museum's photo archive. And then as a third and final, I'll bring up some details. As a third and final stage of this work, I enter with painting. And then painting for me becomes a place where I get to intervene, both in the book and into the image. And it's a way for me to alter the narrative of the original material, alter the story of how we read these types of images. And so this is a sort of final detail of this piece. And so this is an in-progress image of the piece that's hanging there in the middle, just to give you a sense of the way that it's made. So the book pages are laid down, and then this photo transfer is made, and then on top of that, here's the final image. And there are 6 works in this series because the number of pages of the book necessitate or delimit how many paintings I can make. And so there are 3 full-size portraits and then 3 mid-size portraits that I made. And this is the first time, as I had mentioned in my previous talk, that I was able to bring together a 20-year history of experimentation with book pages, photography, archival photography, and painting. And so this was an important important project for me. And it was made in 2019 when I was at the Villa Romana at this fellowship that was sponsored by Germany. This is a detail. I'll take you through. And I would just say that a word about process and priming. So traditionally in painting, when you prime the canvas, you make the canvas white, pristine, and smooth, and you make it ready for you to enter in and create your masterwork. And so you can see what I'm doing as a very elaborate kind of priming, but instead of creating a white and neutral surface, I'm instead layering voices, histories, images underneath my voice in the process of, I think, creating a kind of dialogue. So the paintings for me these works act in this way for me. So it's changing the parameters of how we think of priming, but it can be seen that way. And I think this is the last image from this project. The next work I will talk about is one called This Bridge Called My Back, and it makes reference to a famous collection of feminist writings of women of color. And it is a project that is based on this book that's seen here in this slide, Die Rassenschönheit des Weibes, which is the racial beauty of women. And it was written by a German gynecologist in the early 1900s, and it attempts to create a scientific perspective or analysis on women's beauty, which created a kind of pyramid structure with white women on top and everybody else in kind of gradations below. And for me, using the same process. This project was made directly after I finished this other project We've Come a Long Way to Be Together. I made the first 2 paintings from this while still at the Villa Romana. So I actually cut the book apart, used the original book pages that you see here, then the photographic transfer. Here you see the sort of in-process image. This is the work when it's finished. And I've then used images of women that are coming directly from this book, enlarged and placed onto the pages of the book, and then using painting to dress them and intervene. And in this one, there's the glasses reference Elton John's glasses, and there's also my research goes from anthropology to fashion as well. This is another one of the other works from the series. It's an ongoing series. I've only made 4 works so far. These 2 works that I've just shown are up in New York right now at PPOW in a group show about insurgent commemoration, which is, I think, a nice concept. And then I think this is the last image I've included from this project. And I just wanted to kind of put this as a sort of bridge. So this is kind of also ongoing. And then I want to end by talking about the Oak Creek project, which is in the other gallery. And this is the last image. It was installed using this custom-made wallpaper is actually the end papers of the original book, and so I wanted to kind of create an architectural space that referenced the book and give the paintings a kind of context. So now I'm going to switch to talking about Enter My Burning House, and I'd like to actually begin by reading the names of those killed. So I started this project, Enter My Burning House, and this is Prakash Singh. He was born on November 1st, 1972. He was killed on August 5th, 2012. This is Sita Singh. He was born on November 15th, 1970, and he was killed, on August 5th, 2012. And language is important, so so Ranjit Singh, he is the brother of Sita Singh. He was born on April 4th, 1963, and he was killed on August 5th, 2012. This is Barum Jeethcore. She was born on April 25th, 1971, and she was killed on August 5th, 2012. This is Satwant Singh Kaleka. He was born on June 2nd, 1947, and he was killed on August 5th, 2012. Suveg Singh, he was born on June 6, 1928, and he was killed on August 5th, 2012. And the last portrait is of Baba Punjab Singh, who was actually paralyzed on the day of the attacks. And he was born on August 11th, 1947, and died on March 2nd, 2020, last year. So I wanted to start first by focusing on these members of the Sikh community who were victims of horrible, horrific violence targeted towards immigrants. And anti-migration movements are deeply intertwined with forms of white supremacy. And Madison Grant, the author of The Passing of the Great Race, is an iconic and influential example of this. And so my motivation for this project was, on the one hand, to be able to link these types of histories, but at the same time, I didn't want to privilege Madison Grant's voice and his book, and yet wanting to bring it into conversation as somehow being responsible in part for the structures of violence that are continuing to affect our lives and vulnerable communities. So this project started with a wish to understand simply Sikh migration to California, but it instead became a set of questions that were both national and international in nature. How are certain forms of environmentalism underwritten by racist ideologies that in turn enact violence upon vulnerable immigrant communities? So that's sort of the central question for me. And so I'm going to conclude my talk by talking somewhat about my reflections on what it means to return to California. And so returning to California, I was returning with some knowledge about its history and its place in the world. It's the world's 7th largest economy. It has created the largest prison building project in the world. It leads the country in rates of poverty. But what I didn't know is that California's first governor, Peter Burnett, and the co-founder of Sacramento, openly advocated Native extermination. I didn't know that there existed Indian slave markets of children in Sacramento, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And my parents chose to settle in California perhaps without this understanding of its long and painful history. And this choice of them choosing California connects me through my birth to a place that is founded through genocide and slavery. And so I'd actually like to end by returning to David Stannard's book, American Holocaust, and read a short passage from it. So he writes, with dreary regularity, in countless other locales across the length and breadth of Mexico and down into Central America, the European intrusion meant the sudden and near total disappearance of populations that had lived and flourished there for thousands upon thousands of years. Those natives who survived remembered, however, and in poetry they passed on to posterity the dreadful tale of what had happened. So, recalled an Aztec poet, broken spears lie in the road. We have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. Worms are swarming in the streets and plazas, and the walls are splattered with gore. The water has turned red as if it were dyed. And when we drink it, it has the taste of brine. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls. For our inheritance, our city is lost and dead. Excuse me. And the last part that I wanted to conclude with was the Mayan book of Chilembalam, which is a 15th century text that wasn't burned, as most texts from the region were. Stannard quotes from the book, what the white lords did when they came to our land. They taught fear and they withered the flowers, so that their flowers should live. They maimed and destroyed the flower of others, marauders by day, offenders by night, murderers of the world. So that's it. Thank you. It's a bit heavy. As I like to say, genocide is a party killer, so.
Yeah. Well, it is so moving. I think we're all affected by what you read, but it's in the show, your dedication to remembering what happened, and I think probably surely to make a better world through what you're doing. It's actually got me a little rattled right now, but I do want to, we have some wonderful panelists we're eager to hear from, and I want to introduce them. I have some brief bios I'm going to read, and I want to thank them for coming. It's an honor to meet you, my colleagues I would never otherwise meet, possibly. To start with Suzette Men, next to Raj. Dr. Suzette Men is associate professor at the University of California, Davis, where she teaches Asian American studies, art history, curatorial studies, and cultural studies. Hide my paper here. She is also an independent curator. She received her PhD from Brown University. Prior to her appointment at UC Davis, she taught at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University in New York City, and was assistant curator of contemporary art at the Drawing Center in New York. Min was also Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of English at Pomona College. She is the author of Unnameable, The Ends of Asian American Art, published in 2018. Her research interests include Asian American literature, ethnic American literature, Asian American art, contemporary art, and visual culture. And then Dr. Heidy Sarabia on my left here was born and raised in Mexico City and migrated to Sacramento in the 1990s with her family. She is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Sac State, teaching classes in the sociology of globalization, social movements, and social change and migration in Latin America. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania from 2014 to 16, before returning to Sacramento to accept her position here. Dr. Sarabia's research focuses on globalization processes, such as global stratification, borders and borderlands, border violence, transnational social change, and immigrant adaptation and incorporation in the United States. And then finally, in the center here is Dr. Maria Elena Vargas, an assistant professor of ethnic studies at Sacramento State. She received her PhD in American Studies from University of Maryland, College Park. Her work focuses on transnational and decolonial approaches that challenge the impunity of racialized, femicized, or hypersexualized racial violence towards indigenous women in Guatemala. Her areas of specialization include Central American studies, women and gender studies, and decolonial studies. So we're going to start with Dr. Min, right, on the left next to, on my left, right next to Raj Kamal.
Firstly, I want to thank Raj Kamal for your amazing art practice and your rich body of work, and for your moving presentation. And Kelly for organizing this amazing, fantastic exhibition in the midst of a pandemic. And thank you, Elaine, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to meet Maria and Heidy, and thank you all for coming during your lunch hour. So I'm here to start the conversation of the many different ways we could talk and engage Raj Kamal's work. So I thought I'd start the conversation by, one way is to discuss, we could discuss, for example, more about your formal strategies, your art practice as a reading practice. And in turn, I thought we could also talk about the different approaches of reading her work, but also the different approaches that she invites us to read photography differently. So for example, perhaps we could think about approaching Raj Kamal's work through the scholarship of Ariella Azoulay, who in her recent work has analogized photography with imperialism, for example, and thinking about maybe photography started in 1492. What I like about her work is that she encourages us to use our civic skills to be responsible and to read photography responsibly, but also to open it up. She challenges the temporality of photography and thinking about photography as a fixed object. Very similar to another scholar, namely Rayford, who writes about photography. She specifically focuses on civil rights photography and thinking about it as a living text. And what this means is by looking at the photograph, not just from the photographer's point of view or from the person who's commissioning the photograph, but from the point of view of all the participants, both inside and outside the frame. And by doing that, one reanimates the photograph, opens it up, which I think Raj is doing amazingly and in interesting ways. Another way to think about, another approach to engaging Raj Kamal's work is thinking about, for example, the scholarship by Elspeth Brown and Tifu about feeling photography, or Tina Kamp's book on listening to images, right, in which they apply and integrate affect theory, right, in reading photography. I think about Tina Kamp's invitation to listen to images, to be attuned, to be attentive. And I wonder if we could talk about, in your studio, what kind of conversations, dialogues are you having, with the many people that you have rendered. Thinking about feeling photography and just, I'm thinking about not just, so I was gonna talk a lot about people of the earth. I love this piece a lot. There's so much, it's so rich. But also I was thinking not just about the works of Tina Kempton and the notion of feeling photography in terms of reading this work, but also in terms of reading, for example, we've come a long way to be together, and thinking of Enter My Burning House. And especially in relation to the anti-Asian violence that continues today. It just didn't happen last year, also in light of, in response to COVID-19, but also from the 19th century for a very, very long time. And I'm thinking, on one hand, we still have, we have this, overload of images, we're surrounded by them, and we see all these mass media images all the time, and we're very familiar with mass shootings and anti-Asian violence. And there's oftentimes a disconnect, or we get desensitized. On the other hand, and this is not just anti-Asian violence, but violence on the border, thinking about migrant refugees, and both here and then in Europe. But at the same time, we have this sort of disconnect. We're also obsessed with looking at images of violence. We have a preoccupation with them, and what I feel that you are really sort of opening up a different way of looking at these images. And I like that idea of this sort of insurgent commemoration, because I feel that you're doing that in your recent body of work, or the work in progress, but also in this work of, Enter My Burning House, in really interesting ways. And so we could talk about that, and I think Maria's gonna address that too. And then lastly, we could also talk about your work in relation to Asian American art. one of the things that I wrote about in Unnameable is really rethinking the category, the categorical imperative of Asian American art, and what is it and what does it do? And I really think Raj Kamal's work is really pushing the contours, the boundaries, the possibilities of what Asian American art is and does. Thank you.
Hello. Take off my mask. Hello. Yes, well, I am not an artist, so I kind of feel a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I think the interdisciplinary, experts that are in this panel is going to make for a very insightful and intimate conversation in terms of different forms that we engage with histories of erasure. I'm very honored to be sitting here and have this opportunity. I want to thank Kelly, CRISJ, Manuel Barajas for always supporting my work and saying, hey, Maria knows a little something of this. So yes, I'm, very forever grateful. So I wanted to start with just speaking to the question of how Kahlon's, Raj's art on view functions for me as a site of resistance. And I'm just gonna read out my responses. Through the visual, Raj has transformed the colonial record to be empowering, to enunciate, to humanize, to resist. In her own words, I listened to your talk in September. She has, quote, rehabilitated distorted histories, end of quote. By using interdisciplinary methods, she has deconstructed disciplinary knowledges and institutions, such as anthropology and the military, by producing new meanings and possibilities. What stands out to me the most about Raj's work is how she works with histories of erasure that are mediated through violence and trauma, yet manages to interrupt the process of dehumanization and brutalization to create new possibilities for healing. In the past few years, I have been troubled by some social science methodology centered on the trauma of communities of color or LGBTQ communities that rely heavily on empirical data to quantify a truth imbued in scientific and evidentiary value. These studies pose the danger of perpetuating harmful stereotypes and norms that already dehumanize marginalized groups and are also limited in critical analysis of racist and gendered structures, and as a result, can end up sensationalizing the pain and suffering of the oppressed. However, Raj's work truly taps into the healing practices showing that art is the perfect site for trauma to be released and for healing to begin. And I also want to connect my research to Raj's work, which is a bit complicated, but I'll try to break it down. Raj's art relates to my own work because we both work with archival histories of erasure, but we also commemorate the absences in different ways. My work focuses on the lack of legal justice granted to indigenous women who experienced sexual violence during Guatemala's 36-year civil war, which is actually the largest and bloodiest civil war in Latin America and also 21st century genocide. I interrogate the ways in which racialized feminicides have historically dehumanized indigenous women and excluded them from discourses of vision, constructed by Western positivist knowledges to reinscribe the ideal human rights subject. The majority of the victims of the Civil War whose families have gained justice are non-indigenous heterosexual men who participated in labor unions, farm worker organizations, and militant guerrillas. The reason for this is because all of the acts of violence committed during the war have been archived using visual discourses that can be recognized and seen by American viewers. such as photographs in military logbooks, heard through testimonies of wives and mothers, and traced through declassified police and military records. In other words, it is normative subjectivities that can literally be seen in the archives of terror. Their names and even brutalized bodies can be found buried in clandestine cemeteries for the families to bury. But racialized and gendered subjects remain disappeared in the pages of military and police logbooks, and their bodies have not yet been found or identified. In my work, I have found that non-indigenous, middle-class, urban, leftist men who were victims of enforced disappearance, of course not sexual violence, were human enough to matter in the face of the assassin. However, the indigenous women and girls subjected to sexual torture who did not belong to any revolutionary organization, whose murder and rape required no calculated planning, were brutalized for simply existing. But we will never know their names or their struggle because their death and brutalization was never documented. In her critique of dominant human rights discourses, Wendy Hesford proposes that human rights internationalism discourse is made up of transnational networks of institutions that construct normative narratives of human rights crimes and subjects, such as the United Nations and non-governmental organization. Hesford argues that these narratives depend on visual discourse and on scenes of recognition constituted by Eurocentric human rights norms that privilege only what can be seen. Hesford defines visual discourse as made up of experiences of speech and writing that have acquired the symbolic and social value of, quote, seeing is believing, such as photographs, documentaries, and the act of witnessing. As a result, human rights courts demand evidentiary value, and in a case for it, evidentiary value in a case for it to be believed. Therefore, photographs, documentaries, archival documents act as rhetorical constructs that contextualize the suffering ideal human rights subject. My main argument is that dominant truth and justice rhetoric under the name of human rights becomes a contentious site for gendered indigenous bodies because the hierarchy of victimhood deploys race, gender, class, and sexuality difference to maintain structures of power that produce a reoccurring cycle of vulnerability for indigenous women. And this is because racialized feminicide does not only connote the current feminicides in Latin America that is now known, right, as the most dangerous hemisphere for women, or the Mujeres de Juárez in the 1990s, right, where we began to see bodies, limbs, dismemberment of sexual torture remains of young women who were maquiladora workers in Juárez, right? Feminicide did not start in the 1990s. It is not a new phenomenon. It is racialized feminicide in its cyclical, right, kind of non-linear understanding of indigenous, right, and Black bodies being, always targeted, being rapeable, disposable in terms of colonialism, civil war, and current feminicides. For me, Raj's work has made me hopeful that these histories of erasure can, in her own words, be drawn into existence. However, in my work, I have also come across what Guatemalan scholar Egla Martinez Salazar calls violent silences, which is the ontological yet unimaginable horrors experienced by indigenous women, not only during the height of genocide in Guatemala Civil War in 1982, but in their everyday life. Violent silence transcends the written record and creates a countervisual that dares to imagine the unspeakable violence that has never been uttered or seen, other than by the victim and perpetrator. My work forces me to think about how can we work with violent absences where humanity never existed through the colonizer's gaze? Violent absences that feel overpowered by brutalization are what to this day haunt me. However, Raj provides an alternative in which, through the use of her hands, she gives agency back. She gives form so that we can mourn and begin to heal. Kahlon has altered and rearranged the seeing is believing, embedded with Western knowledges itself, to truly create new possibilities of healing. I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you for, can you hear me? I can't hear myself very well. Thank you for the invitation to this interdisciplinary panel. I think the conversations is very rich because of the different perspectives. And so my perspective on Raj's work comes from my own experience as an immigrant from Mexico who came to California in the 1990s, to Sacramento in the 1990s, but also from my academic work as an immigration voter and globalization scholar. So I want to discuss Raj's work in relation to my own work along the US-Mexico border and how the regime of mobility is shockingly, painfully illustrated in Raj's piece, not only from a historical perspective, but speaking to the contemporary horrors that we are witnessing. So art as a visual medium has the power to reveal, sometimes highlight, or emphasize aspects of the social world that are not always so obvious. And so in many ways, it is the visual element of art that brings to the forefront these issues that sometimes just operate as a background of everyday life. And so sometimes we tend to see violence as the exception, as an aberration, rather than cyclical and ever-present in this context of coloniality. And so art that centers social justice as a perspective, as a framework, has the power to reveal these issues of injustice, inequality, and oppression, and so they become the medium to express the voices and perspectives that power often silences and obscures. And so Raj's work is a beautiful juxtaposition of the visual power of art with a sharp critique of the colonizing project that used knowledge production in the form of science, anthropology, history, to justify and reify the power dynamics and inequalities brought about by the colonial project. And so, as I read her work, she centers race not as a side note, not as an accident, but as the organizing principle of colonialization and of today's world. And so I want to address in particular the series of We Have Come a Long Way Together, because in this series, I feel that Raj's work allows us to acknowledge the diversity in the context where the colonial project homogenized the colonized into regional groupings that make little sense locally, but have become reified, and so today they seem as normal and natural. So today we think about or talk about Latin American people, or Asian people, or Middle Eastern people, Southeast Asian people, and it seems an appropriate grouping, but I think, at least for me, Raj's work forces us to see the fragmentation and the diversity, and so I'm thinking about the multiple travelers that can be in some ways, when seeing the British Airways, for example, you think about the diversity and particularity of experiences on the move today. And so in my own work along the US-Mexico border, I explored these differences and how the regimes of border policing and enforcement really shaped how people are able to move around the world. And so travelers are not just sort of these European travelers, but people with the means to get passports, to get visas, to travel the world. And so in that way, there's sort of an ideology that becomes racially neutral, because it's not about race, it's about whether you have a passport. But underneath those systems are sort of the racial logics that really stratify the world into the haves and the have-nots, the ones who are able to move freely and experience a borderless world versus those who are experiencing the policing and enforcement of borders in very violent ways. And so I think when I saw that I don't know if anybody's watching Ted Lasso, but if you are, right, it sort of highlights these the importation of people that is facilitated by capitalism and the accumulation of capital, the production of cosmopolitan citizens from the global north, from the global south, the global elite who's able to move if you have the means, if you serve the interests of capitalist accumulation, then the world becomes a borderless world. We do see that. But Raj's work juxtaposes these borderless vision, people with Pan Am bags, right, ready to move, with people like women in the light vest, people living hard conditions, provoked by the very economic systems that creates the borderless world for capital, that intensifies climate change, that provokes political instability. These poor people who are unable to get visas, unable to qualify for refugee or asylum status, those we see are being received very differently. We have seen the images of border violence, children in cages, people corralled by horses, and these are the very people that are moving because of this sort of the colonial legacy. And so we want to ignore the racial components of this border violence, but at the root of it is, again, this racial system that has, as the organizing principle that really informed the colonial project and continues to inform our systems of oppression today. So it's very easy to use very racial neutral language to talk about environmental concerns or systems of managing mobility, but at the root of it is these racialized, these racial projects of differentiation and stratification. And so Raj's work forces us to think about the stories, the histories, through the use of these historical books behind these individuals. For me, she forced us to imagine and reflect on how and why people are on the move and whether their mobility is facilitated or opposed by the global north, and the consequences of policing the movement of these bodies. I feel like even in her attention to just the eyes, I could sort of try to imagine the stories behind those individuals on the move. And so the piece, both for me, summarizes this juxtaposition of the forces of movement that moves the lens from the group, the masses, the statistics, the numbers, the undistinguishable groups of masses to the individual, and it shifts to focus it shifts the lens to force us to imagine the horrors that people are fleeing, risking their own lives to escape these horrors, forcing us to think again about the individual behind these stories and these statistics and these numbers. But it was very interesting because when I first saw Boat, immediately I think about the Mediterranean Sea and the humanitarian crisis. But then as I sort of stayed a little bit longer, I started to think about Haitian and Cuban migration. I started to think about Mexican migrants coming in the Pacific Sea today, and so that Raj's work is both specific, it's particular, it's about specific histories, but also this universal and global process that is creating this mass movement of people that is being reacted to in a very specific and racialized way. It's about specific horrors people are fleeing, but also about the commonalities, the universal forces, and so it makes us reflect on the humanity of people on the move, and I really appreciated that. After all, we all have the right to be free, to move freely, to seek a better life, but couched under this language and narrative of racially neutral laws. Are you eligible to apply for asylum or refugee? Are we concerned about environmental degradation? Then the narratives of the colonial project become neutralized in ways that then that make these stories invisible. And so I think Raj's work highlights the capriciousness of policing mobility, the violence that this policing is enacting on people, poor people from the global south on the move, and for people without the economic means to have alternative ways to move. And so I really appreciate that. And I think I want to end sort of my piece on sort of the Women with Hands, because it reminded me of Frida's piece, Las Dos Fridas, the two Fridas. And I think that piece in particular highlighted or brought for me a more personal kind of reflection on the experiences of those of us who have been colonized, who have been acculturated. And now that we inhabit these colonial spaces of higher education, how do we navigate these dualities of colonized experience, and how do we experiment with decolonization as a resistance, as a knowledge-making project? So we simultaneously are seen as suspects, outsiders, illegitimate knowledge production makers, but we're never quite able to escape the stereotype of being unruly, savage, or primitive, and yet we are inside these sort of academic spaces, and so we are both embracing pre-colonial, decolonial knowledge and trying to push the boundaries, and so that we can create something that makes us move past that colonial production of knowledge and traps us inside of that colonial projects. And so the hands, in some ways, for me, represented these multiple hats and tasks and jugglings of work, personal, institutional, and trying to push the boundaries. So I was very curious to sort of hear about Raj's own experience, sort of navigating these contradictions within academia, that sort of we become a little bit of insiders, but remain outsiders forever because of, again, these sort of like colonial trajectories. So I'm very curious to hear about that. Thank you very much.
Well, Raj, you must feel deeply
Amazing and
Yeah.
very honored.
It's wonderful. The understanding of the art and I want to hear we all want to hear from Raj about her response to them, but to the panelists. But the idea, when I first saw the show, I think one of the things I said to Kelly was, "Is it hopeful?" Because I was feeling really sad, but then we both decided, it really is just the act of making art is, but I think especially what Maria and Heidy found in the work is just really makes me see it in more profound ways. And also who looks at art, it's like the art is made for everyone. It's not really an art world production made for art people. So anyway, I'm going to stop. I want to hear from you. I want you to feel you could talk with each other.
Okay. Me? I'm next. I don't. I have like pages of notes of like everything that you said. It's yeah. I mean, maybe I just start with what's freshest and about this thing I wrote that we're savage and unruly beings in these academic and white institutions, and it's something I think about a lot. I'm about to become a professor and it's interesting because Germany doesn't collect racial statistics because of what happened under National Socialism. They understand collecting racial statistics as racist. So you have no way of, so it creates a problem because you cannot track what's happening, where there's progress and where there's not. And it seems I might be the first professor of painting that's a woman of color ever in Germany. But it's not, you can't know it for sure because there's no statistics to refer to, but no one can remember there ever having been one. And so this is on my mind a lot somehow, how I'm going to be in this institution. And yet I have been recently gaining a lot of strength from looking at Cedric Robinson's career and the Black radical tradition in the US, which I didn't know anything about, but here was somebody who wrote this really important book on Black Marxism that influenced every Black intellectual today that we know of. Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten said reading it was like a bomb going off in his head. He influenced generations of scholars, but he didn't have an obituary in any major paper in the country. And he did this work about linking histories of colonialism, slavery, but also with capitalism and critiques of capitalism. And I feel like this perspective is somehow what gets lost there have been these kind of movements of different incursions into into academic spaces of different kinds of ethnic studies, basically, which began, I think, as radical projects and have become somehow co-opted into kind of a neoliberal frame. And that is really problematic. And for me, it's like, how do we as people who have power and access and privilege remain in service to communities that are rendered vulnerable by capitalism? We are the exceptions that have gotten on the inside, but then the idea for me is that we should be in service to those communities and not to our own advancement within these institutions that are really there to erase, and maintain certain hierarchies. So that's kind of that thought about how do we exist in this, maybe we can have it more as a dialogue. Like, I don't if you guys have thoughts about that too, since you guys have been working longer in institutions yourselves. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that for me, you bring up these sort of like contradictions and these negotiations of sort of trying not to lose your voice and your perspective, that it's different, unique, that adds in the context where you are being pushed to kind of acculturate and assimilate to the expectations of an institution that are meant to erase those very voices, that are meant to whitewash those kind of radical perspectives. So I think it's always a tension, and it's, but I appreciate, I think that, at least for me, being rooted in those communities, in sort of thinking about sort of, it's not about you as an individual, right? But it's about sort of the collective, the historical memory that you want to pay attention to and really, kind of elaborate on in these institutions. So I really appreciate that you are sort of, I mean, I would be surprised if you didn't, because your work obviously shows that, right, this attention, but I really appreciate the sort of like acknowledgement of the contradictions that these institutions kind of, bring for us. Yeah.
Yes, and just having this conversation, is intimate in itself. And I've been very grounded, I think, through Chicanx feminisms, and it's it's beautiful that you've called, one of your works, This Bridge Called My Back, because that was one of my kind of coming to consciousness, reading that, as a sophomore in undergrad. But Gloria Anzaldúa always, right, reminds us to do work that matters. Emma Perez always reminds us to decolonize history. And I think that, it took me many, many years to come to the work that I do now, but I think that, in terms of navigating academia, my body, my work, because it's also, I have found that I'm judged sometimes more because of my research than how I look like or my racial, ethnic. So I think, it is something that, nothing prepares you for, those contradictions. And you make it work in your own hybridity and kind of you're reborn, I feel, constantly, especially myself. I identify as a queer lesbian woman. And so, but I really feel that that is the passion. If I didn't have that passion for my work, as I feel all of us have here, we wouldn't be in academia. So for me, it's as you said, using the privilege, I teach my students, to use your education to argue for your family, for the marginalized communities, to finally find the language and lexicon and argument, even by learning how to speak in the master's tongue, so you can come back, right? Chela Sandoval, History of the Oppressed, and speak that and break it down, deconstruct, and build something new. And we definitely, I'm always guided by the ghosts of my ancestors. And I think that's why, for me, your work feels so soothing, because it feels, right, just, I don't know, it just comforting, which is interesting because, it is so violent. But, that is the contradiction we live in also in our own bodies and our own research, the students we teach. Teaching, coming from Maryland, which was predominantly white, mid-Atlantic students from New Jersey to San Francisco State and Sacramento, also, right, just changes a lot of your pedagogical as well, which also shifts your perspective in academia.
So I think your observations about the institutionalization of ethnic studies is on target. At the same time, ethnic studies is always subject to be cut. The first, the budgets are always about to be cut. And my gut feeling is that in the University of Hamburg, the students are going to be so lucky, and they're going to find you. And that the one thing is, I do think that, along with institutionalization of ethnic studies, is the sort of motivation to, or mobilization to contain, right, knowledge. And I love the fact that, you can create disorder. I mean, you talk about your aesthetic strategy as interruption, but it's also about disruption. The one thing that I forgot to say in my sort of introduction is the one thing, you have taken such great care and generosity in your engagement with the archive, with the photographic archive. And when I hear your readings of the different works that really moved you, it's really nice to see that, you sort of this notion of care has extended to reading practice, which is great. But also, one thing is, we had talked about this last week, about how you intend and you continue. It's more of not just intend, but you will continue and you'll bring this to the studio, to your students, about teaching with care, right? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, I mean, right now, is this on? Yeah, okay. No, thank you. And I have been thinking about, it's something that's developed over time, but understanding painting as care work. So the same, and taking it out of this kind of masculine history and tradition, and trying to reinterpret it and understand it that way. And more than just painting as care work, I was thinking about how am I going to teach when I arrive in Hamburg? And the two principles upon which I thought I would center my first year there were the ideas of embodiment and care, and creating communities of care as a decolonial practice. And I've been thinking about this, focusing on this book that has just come out called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. And it's written by a social scientist and a doctor. And it really talks about all of, so everything that's happening to the environment is actually happening on the insides of our bodies too. And bringing these histories of colonialism, connecting it to the pandemic, connecting it to environmental pollution, and their prescription for this, for all of this inflammation that is inflaming the world, is inflaming our bodies, is through creating communities of care. And this is as a decolonial work that will can undo different kinds of systems of oppression that are in place and affecting so many vulnerable communities. And so, so I've been thinking a lot about the idea of care So I think that, I would say that.
And I think it kind of reminds me of this concept of historical memory and the way that our bodies kind of remember, because we have lost so much, right? As when you read that piece from American Holocaust, just any time I think about how much we have lost, right? My first language is Spanish and my second language is English, and so I don't have the vocabulary or the language of my ancestors. And in some ways, I think, and yet the body kind of knows and remembers both the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the current, right, as this. And so it's sort of interesting to think about sort of our relationships to each other and to the world and to our past in ways that might not be sort of Western-centric, right, that move us beyond kind of like that construction of knowledge. And I think that your art just kind of forces to go there, to think about, like you were saying, right, the embodiment of historical memory, that it's just so powerful and moving. And in many ways, I think I don't know what I would call it. I don't know that I would call it hopeful, but it makes us kind of open our eyes and think about these issues that in many ways, I think for some of us, we can't just ignore. We can't just move on. We can't just, we have to confront. And so I think your art, it's a powerful sort of reminder of the things that we have to confront, that we can't just kind of move away from. So I really appreciate that.
I just want to say that just to mention, because I didn't in my introduction of these three projects, but for me, thinking about beauty and humor next to histories of trauma and violence are really important, and strategies both of balance, but also of how do you sustain contact with very difficult histories. And this has been my answer, is this kind of creating works that are hopefully sensual in a certain way, that keep your attention, and ask you to stop and pause to consider a history you would normally run the other way from knowing, and that somehow it's always been my understanding. I used to really hate when people said that I made political work, because I would say, because for me I was this. once I was okay with this label, it was once I decided I had to expand what the category of political means. And that is because I think we experience political violence on an intimate scale, and we experience it through our bodies. And this is not a way we talk about politics, through this intimate encounter with violence. And somehow it's talked about abstractly, historically, in these other terms, but never intimately. And it's this intimacy that I'm trying to somehow focus on in my work, yeah.
On the note of care work, right, I wanted to specifically speak to Enter My Burning House. Which, just beautiful, very striking when I saw it the first time. And when I went back home and just like really was pondering and allowing kind of the feelings to connect with my mind, it felt like an altar to me. Even how it's arranged, like the photographs or the paintings are arranged almost as if framed photographs that, for those of you, that are not familiar, an altar is, it's an indigenous Mexican tradition of, that is celebrated November 2nd, El Día de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. And, it's a very intimate, tradition of putting an altar or a table and then the pictures of your loved ones who have passed away and through whatever, reasons. And to me, an altar is very spiritual because, not only do you give offerings, like you cook their favorite foods or you put objects that remind you of them, you celebrate the good and the memories, but it's that sacred space that allows you to have dialogue with them. My grandma raised me, we would go to, she would take me, I was little, like 4 or 5 years old, and she would take me to Mexico, and we would sit on the tombs of, gravestones of my great-grandparents and talk to them, very a very spiritual connection, to our past, to our loved ones. And, I was just, on the notion that Heidy talked about in terms of your work forces us to confront. I think it's also, of course, the senseless, tragic act of hatred that caused, as you said, language is very important. This was murder, right? This was domestic terrorism. But I think in framing it as an altar, and if someone were to go and see it, they are forced to kind of speak intimately and in silence with the 7 Sikh people, and also confront the circumstances in the histories, right, of imperialism, immigration, xenophobia, while you're seeing them in the eyes, confronting them. And I also agree with Heidy, there's something in the eyes, of all of yours, all of them, that is just, it's so humane. It's, you want to know their stories, right? You enter through their accord and their terms. And, to me, also, you bringing forth, the faces and names, of the 7 Sikh people is also very personal to me because, August 3rd, which is interesting, right? 2 days before August 5th, but 2019 instead of 2012, the Walmart massacre in El Paso, where 23 people died, including Mexican nationals. Most of the people were elderly families shopping for school supplies on a Sunday morning. In El Paso, young man, drove from Dallas 8 hours to El Paso, Texas, to the borders to kill Mexicans. And I read the manifesto of this terrorist, and he praised the far-right ideology of an Australian terrorist. who shot 51 Muslims, ages 33 through 77, in a mosque at CRISJ, New Zealand, on March 5th, 2019. The El Paso Terrorist claims that Tarrant, the last name of that terrorist manifesto, inspired him to target Mexicans instead of non-white Americans. To him, it made sense that the most threatening enemies of New Zealand were Muslims because they were immigrants, the instigators and the invaders, just like Mexicans in the US. Immigration was so appalling to him that he argued for the deportation of Mexican Americans, who he saw as his worst enemy because they were the children of Mexicans, and could transform Texas into a blue state and grant open borders, free health care, education to immigrants. His manifesto expresses a racist imagination in which the white supremacist is enraged by the continuous survival of people of Mexican descent. This conviction to the ownership of the Americas reflects the racial anxiety that constructs Mexicans as immigrants in their ancestral homeland. This white supremacist ideology led him to reenact the genocidal actions of his ancestors and declare himself the vigilante of killing Mexicans like the Texas Rangers did in 1918 when they murdered 15 Mexican boys and men in Porvenir, Texas, which is 3 hours from El Paso, which really, shows the darkness and, the blood of West Texas. So it's also interesting, right, that it was the anti-immigrant fervor and nativist rage, that targeted immigrants, Muslims, Sikh, Mexican. And to see their faces, to build an altar, to kneel and bow and cry in their name, and also honor. And I really liked how in your talk you said, what responsibility do we have, right? And other scholars talk about this as well, kind of the ethics of shared responsibility. And I think that in an altar, seeing that person's eyes, you have to reckon with that.
So you're just making me think about, Enter My Burning House and how to reconcile the portrait with the text. And now I'm like thinking, I got it now. So when you talk about loss, right, and grief, I mean, they're like, the portraits are like manifestations of racial melancholia, right? Of racial melancholia, in which it's about melancholy and loss and grief, but also grievance, right? And then the text reminds us of the reasons of why they died, or the motivations, but also that there's a long history. It's an ongoing history. And so that's I think there's a tension that's going on. Because then I was thinking, is the portraits, are they like, it's kind of like graffiti where you're desecrating this text, or like, are you covering over the text? Like, what is the relationship between the painted portrait and the text itself? So now you're sort of like, when you guys were talking, I'm like, okay, I think I've got this sort of engagement relationship, so.
I also, when I started this project, I didn't know what the role of painting would be in the work, but once I made the work, I went through a process of developing a relationship with each of the individuals in a very different way than before I had started the project, and it was just through the sheer contact with their image. And thinking about them, and it surprised me because, you have these conceptual categories. It's a memorial project, but then what does that mean? And so, and it's this, and if you're really remembering who they are or who they were or thinking about them, like the first person I showed, Prakash Singh, was a Granthi, which is a priest, and he, they're usually poor in Sikh churches. They don't have a lot of education. He was the youngest member killed, and his wife and daughter had just arrived in the U.S. They were going to get their first apartment when he was killed, and I don't know what happened to them. And, this is like, but these kinds of thinking about the loss for these families, for this community, and but bigger than that, like how does this connect into larger patterns of violence in our country and internationally? And for me, what was most surprising was this sort of ecological fascism. So apparently, the killer in New Zealand, as well as in El Paso, also voiced sort of environmental concerns, and so with this idea of population, because the legacy of these ideas is written into people that are arguing for control of population, and so they don't want people reproducing, because they think that is the reason that the Earth is collapsing, and so and they use that as this environmental component somehow, or this environmentalism component, is fueling this white supremacist hatred, and it's often missed because it's like I think we are taught to construct the world into very simple categories and boxes, and when all these things start to intertwine and overlap, it becomes very complicated to talk about how the history of, Yosemite is linked to Native genocide, or anti-immigration laws that affected, most of the world in the 20s. It's just like all these things. It's like, I don't know. I think I'm trying by bringing in Madison's text. I also didn't want to privilege him, Madison Grant's text, but I also felt it was important because it's a kind of lost aspect of our history too, that we need to add to contextualize this violence that's missing. And so I'm trying to bring those conversations visually, I guess.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
One thing is what I like about the work is that, the photograph, again, it's not this fixed object, but you sort of you show the excess, right, of photography, and there's also another alternative access, right, to these lives. I was just curious because in this particular body of work, the names of the people who died, and how is that different from the other portraits? And then also, have you shown this in like Wisconsin or like in
No, I just made it. And
you just made for this?
The week
Oh,
after
sorry,
I made
okay.
it, we sent it.
Got
I sent
it,
it to
okay.
Kelly.
Okay.
And so it has never been seen before. So it was made specifically for this exhibition.
Got it, okay.
This project, and I made it specifically thinking about California and this history, and actually Punjabi migration to California. And starting there led me into thinking, finding out about ecological fascism and this role in anti-immigration histories, and that led me to Madison Grant and this book. And then I thought, okay, I don't simply want to work on just immigration, but actually there's this happened in 2012, this killing, and I thought this is the result of one of the results of Madison Grant's book. He's cited by Anders Breivik, who was killed 50 children in Norway, and he cites this book. Adolf Hitler called it his Bible, wrote to him. The National Socialists built a lot of their policies based on the ideas in this book. So it's this powerful resonance in the world, but yet, like, the environmental movement in the U.S. has totally disowned association with Madison Grant, but he's at the beginning of all the environmental movements of the country. He somehow, he somehow became, again, like a kind of a seed and a representation of white supremacy that could be put into a figure, in this book. It could and he popularized all of these ideas. And so this whole notion of replacement theory that is operating today, right? Like this idea that white people, I don't know if you know what yeah, you guys might explain it better than me, but like, the idea that, you know, this fear that some white supremacist groups have been using to, they fear that they're going to die out as a race.
Right.
You know, this, but this was actually popularized by Madison Grant's book. And this notions of race, I think he called it race suicide, though. And so this concept is born there, but it's alive and well today, and affecting all of us without our realizing it. So that's why I chose the book.
Yes, the El Paso Terrorist also, that was one of his main drivers, the replacement theory.
Yeah, this is, yeah.
And it also, they also call it white genocide,
Yeah.
which is what a lot of white supremacist groups have been organizing around, right? So, and it's interesting too, because as many of us, I'm sure, have seen with the current, debate with critical race theory, taken outside of, the university, and now just being part of, parents' concerns, and especially in California, right, the issues of, bringing ethnic studies to high school, and, just critical race theory just being completely decontextualized. I also feel that, these agitators, these white supremacists, co-opt and learn social justice rhetoric. And then they are able to, destroy it, replace it with their own personal benefit and agenda, right? And then throw it back. I had not, to me, reading the replacement theory, in his manifesto or learning more about it was just so far-fetched, so ridiculous. But it is, as you say, people really believe this, and they're committed to it. And the El Paso Terrorist, that was, Texas to him, and it's just fascinating because all of the history of Texas itself. But he wanted to make sure that the white race in his racial imagination would always supersede in superiority and existence.
Okay, we will be opening it to questions soon, in a few minutes, but I would like to come back to this, idea of your art as a site of resistance, which we've been discussing with, I'm just really moved by what I've heard. Of the relevance of your work to the work of our panelists. And I'm wondering, with in contemporary art today, let's say after George Floyd, it's just becoming predominantly politically motivated. So you read an art forum or wherever, it's going to be hyperallergic. They're all going to be featuring artists who are working for this same, you might say, cause, and that we, not exact, but this idea of equity, social justice, and that would include for all species, all this, there's lots of work being done about indigenous futurisms. You might even say feminist futurisms, an idea of caring and restoring. A lot of it is motivated by really profound anxiety about the environment, which feels so urgent, which is so urgent. So it all feels as though, we're talking about the structures, the systems that we need to see, the roots that you've been talking about, how they're all connected. One thing I want to get off track here, but I think that art, what I'm wondering is we have this show here that's obviously been very meaningful to you in ethnic studies and sociology, and is there a potential for all this art to actually reach into your classrooms? Can you integrate it into your curriculum? Is maybe just specifically with Heidy and Maria. Your curriculum, Suzette, I'm not quite clear because you're a little closer to mine, I think.
I'll tell everyone from Davis to come.
So, but this question actually is more directed to in bringing, using art as a site of resistance or a place of remembering, or somehow bringing individuality into this, into this sort of mass of confusion about what social justice directed at, rather than specific individuals, if I'm being clear there. But could you, maybe, Heidy, you could just say, maybe something about that. Have you used this show in your classes yet, or can you see a potential for incorporating it into your teaching?
Absolutely. I teach on a regular basis globalization, sociology of globalization, and again, sort of the show highlights these sort of, from a historical and contemporary perspective, these forces of globalization. But then, as I was sort of thinking about that question, I was thinking, I'm teaching methods this semester, social scientific methods, and we do content analysis, and I think it could potentially. I'm thinking about how to incorporate it, but again, because you juxtapose the text with photography, with painting, so it's this layering that you make, so evident that sometimes we can miss, and I think it sort of, in thinking about the social sciences and how we collect evidence and how we analyze texts and how we observe people and make conclusions about those people, that I think this opens up that conversation about, again, sort of the way that, colonialism has trained us to see some things and not to see others, to prioritize some things and not others. And so it's a wonderful, I think, conversation opener. So I will definitely use it in my classes, yeah. What about you, Maria?
Yes, most definitely. I've already, I hopefully my students, I assigned this for extra credit, so I hope that they're already listening to you. And I went on and on this week in lecture about your work. So yes, I will definitely use your work more intentionally in all of my classes. I'm actually teaching a class in ethnic studies called Genocide in the Holocaust. So yes, maybe I can tweak the syllabus to, definitely insert your work. But again, I think for me, I really want to use your work to really make them understand the responsibility that we have to people who have been brutalized by white supremacy, transphobia, xenophobia, as you were talking about, in the ecological racism. And you said this in your talk as well, to bring awareness to the violence nobody talks about. The violence perpetuated by colonial powers, the cyclical violence, right? That I think it's very important to talk about the histories, right, in order to understand the current occupation, genocide, displacement that we are undergoing as we speak. And you also said in your talk, how to work, how to work in transformation. And I thought that was very powerful, very deep, because ultimately I would want to show my students, right? To me, to work in transformation means always evolving in the uncomfortable, learning from the unknown, confronting. Some students have said to me, your classes are so depressing. Well, yes, we of course, I teach with trigger warnings, but we cannot afford to, turn around the gate, turn a blind eye, so we have to learn from the unknown, look at the resistance and beauty in the darkness, which you have most definitely done, and not settle. So constantly, be reformulating, deconstructing Western knowledge.
So can I just, I do teach art history, but also I was going to say, I feel like your work, your work connects and touches on so many different disciplines and fields in really interesting ways. So I think a class, ethnic studies talking about empire and imperialism, right? Classes about the border, European history, anthropology, art history, photography. I don't know, there's so many ways that your work can be engaged. So I would hope that, I don't know if any of you are all faculty or students, it'd be wonderful to, frame Raj Kamal's work in all these different ways and to have the students come, right, and really, do a report about the book, or a report about the exhibition, or engage it in a paper. I think, I don't know, there's lots of opportunities. And, the show is up until beginning of December, right?
Mid-December.
Mid-December, so there's lots of time to assign and tell them to come to the gallery. There's my pitch, Kelly. Okay.
Okay, so now we are going to hear your questions or your
Yes,
comments.
we want to open it up to questions here in our audience in person, as well as to those who are watching via YouTube. I think that they're able to submit questions. Is that right, Mustafa? So we can read those out loud. I'm going to walk around with the microphone. If you do have a question here in the audience, I want to capture that so that our visitors online can be able to hear things. And then I would also ask for the panelists if you could just repeat the question so we make sure that everyone sort of hears what you're trying to answer. That would be great. So do I have, yeah?
Hi, this is James Fox. I'm here in the library, and I've had a chance to talk to you all week, so I don't want to hog the stage. But I do want to say that I find this work deeply hopeful because it turns the whole colonial enterprise on its head, which usually situates the white European traveling and observing all these other people and categorizing them and controlling them. And what does this do? Who does it put at the center, and who does it put at the periphery? So that's really positive. And I think that we absorb that when we go through it. And the second thing I just want to say is that how it reverberates with the notion of palimpsest, the idea that you rub something away and you write new text on top of it, but what was there originally never disappears. So just think about that too. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that?
Just to say that was a beautiful comment. Thank you. It was very insightful.
Yeah, I will just add to that, James. I think that was really, like everybody said, very insightful. I was interested in Raj's comment in her talk, or her explanation, brief explanation of her process, that when she's painting on these, texts and images, that she's in, you correct me if I've misinterpreted, she's in a kind of dialogue with that past. And so in her actual making process, she's conscious of actually, making a new world with this, from the past. So it's leaving the past, like you said, the document visible, but also responding to it, in that way that, you guys have beautifully said, honors it, but also brings it present into history.
I wanted to add that I thought it was interesting when you explained that, typically we think of a canvas as a white canvas that you prepare, but is it ever really white and empty and blank, right? It never is. Yeah. And so your art highlights that context under which we are working. And so I think it was beautiful because I never thought about sort of, as an artist, you literally begin with a canvas. And so I think we all are working on canvases, and they are never blanked and empty. And so, and thinking about sort of methods in thinking about how we talk about knowledge production, and that the canvas is never blanked. And so it's acknowledging these, history. So it's really powerful. I really enjoyed that, hearing about that.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that, for me, my relationship is not to this history a relationship of erasure. To me, this is fascism, to erase history. Rather, for me, it's important to have a dialogue and to be able to talk back, talk with, and then, as James said, minimizing that or marginalizing that perspective, which has been in the center for so long, and then putting a different perspective in the center that has historically never been there.
Other questions from our audience? Do we have any questions from our YouTube? Not yet? Okay. Great. Come around.
Just for some context, I'm a returning student, so I first went to college in 2000, and I remember taking history classes and never hearing the word colonizer, never hearing the word genocide, and it's only when I've returned that we're hearing these conversations and hearing these words a lot. And so kind of in my span of a 20-year career in college and your 20 years in this body of work, I wonder if you just speak a little bit about the changes you've seen just in the attitudes of the galleries, attitudes of the people who see your work, and maybe some of your hopes for how it will continue.
So when I started, I think started working with colonial Indian photography kind of by accident. I found a book written by a British colonizer about India somehow in the library, and I had kind of read this book, and I was fascinated because they referenced Punjabi Sikh soldiers, and I was just like, how are they described, and I was very interested, and this led me somehow to looking at images that were produced during this period of Indian history, South Asian history. And so I began back, I would say, in 1997, working on colonialism. And when I started and I was going to school in California, nobody was talking about this and nobody cared. And also not even care, it's just that the term settler colonialism didn't exist in terms of the U.S. So I was constantly, I had things said to me by professors that were quite dumb, and I still remember them. And these things were said in critiques, which is I'm making paintings from these photographs, and I can't answer at the time why I'm doing that, even though that was one of the questions. But then the other question to me was, well, the average American is not going to have any connection to colonialism. How do you expect them to relate to this work? And again, I had no answer for this, but I did, in a sense. I had the answer in my work. I then took, these images are small that I was looking at in books. I would then make the figures life-size. I cut them out so they were in the viewer space and not on the wall. And I would force a confrontation with a history, I didn't think that, at the time, I didn't have this language either, but it was like visually I was trying to answer this idea that being American meant that, it was always this question, why are you working on colonialism? You're American. This is like, you didn't grow up in India, so what is this? And then I actually stopped working on just India, because what I came to understand is that in the art world, there is a kind of reduction of identity and pigeonholing of where it's easier to consume your work if you only work on your the identity that you're perceived to have. And so as a South Asian woman, it's expected, if I'm going to be successful, I'm going to work on South Asian women, and that's going to be my little topic. But colonialism is a global project, and for me, I wanted to know why a 19th century anthropological photo taken in Mexico looks exactly or very similar to a photo taken in Egypt at the same time period. And I didn't know the answers to this. It was like giving a talk at Wellesley. And there was to a group of professors there, and there was a woman professor teaching a class on propaganda, and she was like, well, you must know about the photography manuals. And I'm like, what photography manuals? Because I had just given this talk about and putting all these images together from all over the world from the same time period. And she was like, well, you know, photographers, and they had manuals that told them how to photograph their native subjects wherever they were. And that's why all these images, I intuitively was kind of trying to make this connection and work through these histories. And I was also doing it because for me, they told me something about the present that nobody was talking about. And I really wanted to talk about power and how that exists in an image. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I felt like it affected me. I was born in the US, but all my life I've been made to feel foreign here. And I think the fact is that certain photographs have told people what people from India look like. And this has shaped not only their understanding of who I am, but also my understanding of who I am, and limited it. And so it was specifically that it had to be photography, because I think the way photography influences how we see ourselves and how we see others is fundamental to the type of violence we're perpetuating. So, yeah, that would be about back to photography, which is something you had mentioned, yeah. And this now it's become fashionable, and colonialism, the weaponization of identity, the notion of there's a lot of talk of diversity, but nobody talks about capitalism, and so that's why I brought up Cedric Robinson and the Black radical tradition, because you know, if you're not talking about anything, if you're not also linking it to this system that has created vulnerable communities of every color all over the world. And this is what somehow is not part of I think, the discussion in the art world, nor in the mainstream political discussion of this country. It sits on the surface.
Perhaps.
Sorry for proselytizing.
And Rajkamal, I have a follow-up sort of question to that in terms of, I think that your work now is getting better reception than it had when I first saw your work 20 years ago. And because there has been a development in the language and how we can present this work and, as you said, consume it. So how do you we've talked across this panel about the contradictions that you're sort of embracing in your work. So this is another one that I see sort of as in your future as you are now also becoming part of academia in a different way than you have before. So how might, what is my question here? How are you going to embrace that sort of contradiction or that your work can become now more consumable in a certain way?
I don't know. I don't know, but it's on my mind, and it's like, and my husband is a philosopher, and we're both idealists, and we've both been very poor for 20 years. And we're both grappling with the ethics of, I haven't had the position of making art as a luxury good. I've made it as first, it was a survival strategy, and then it's developed into something, an enactment of care towards people that have been, erased. And what does it mean to sell that work? What does it mean to enter into a system, an economic system, that I think is responsible for for destroying our world, destroying the planet, destroying communities. I don't know. I don't know how to deal with this ethical dilemma, but it's a big one for me. No.
Thank you. Any questions from our YouTubers?
Maybe can the gallery collect this work and use this? I mean,
Oh,
one of the things, a university,
that would-
a university setting would be amazing, because that, then the work could be, accessible to students, and they can do more research and engage it. I'm just,
No, I think that's actually an amazing sort of suggestion in how the work be present in the world and the ways that it becomes. I mean, your process itself there's an element of democracy to it. That you want it to be accessible. So the institution of universities and colleges is a great setting for it to be in. Any other questions? Sure.
There was an incredible amount of information shared today, to the point of being overwhelming. And I'm wondering, there was talk about the organizing principles and connections to colonialism and many other types of things. And I'm wondering how that plays with the organizing principles visually, and how you make those choices. And I'm wondering if maybe a little bit of sharing with that could be invaluable for myself as well as some of the others in the audience.
So how do I make my visual decisions in my work, my aesthetic choices?
I'm wondering if the, where is it prioritized? And you talked about it very passionately about intuition and things of those kinds of decision making. And yet there was, the panel was packed with from a very literary tradition. And I'm I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on how you navigate those two worlds, which are connected deeply.
So I have, maybe I'll just describe my process. So I would say that I have a process where I do a lot of what I call research, but this research is a kind of, it might be looking at photos in archives, it might be reading different types of books. There are periods where I do this. And then at a point, this knowledge that I've been collecting, sort of, I kind of close the books, put the things away, and then I go into the studio and with an idea of a kind of a feeling about what I might work on and what I might work with. And and then once I get into the studio, though, like all of this kind of, the symbolic, like the word, this literary stuff, all of that. I hope that basically that there's a process or a time period of where it seeps into my unconscious, and I then start to work in a purely intuitive way, and I then work often with sort of water-based media, and for me it's a space of meditation, it's a space of total freedom. I'm not going in with an agenda about what I have to accomplish. I don't know what's gonna happen. It's often can be scary, and it's, so I have this funny kind of because most people that work with archives and research, they work with film, video, and the language somehow of the archive. Most people don't then try to work with drawing and painting. This is somehow, I don't know many artists that do this. And I think that because I am making some kind of third thing that doesn't exist. And it's meant that my work is seen from both sides, from the left and the right in the art world, as not right or not belonging in some ways, because it's too visual and too sensual for the left, and it's somehow too literary and too research-based for the commercial world, or it has been. But this is what makes sense to me, and this is like how I think. And these are you know, you write beautifully about your theory and logic in the archive, and I was like writing furiously notes about what you were saying. But for me, this is where I'm thinking, and this is how I think. It just happens that into my 30s, I learned how to talk about my work too, because I realized no one was going to step in to speak for me or help, like, theorize my work. So I learned this language that I think most painters don't have, like a kind of a capacity to theoretically also talk about the history and the location of art in relation to other disciplinary fields. But I still privilege the intuitive creative act that is fundamentally different than the way we're talking about ideas here today. And it's a purely visual mode that defies language.
When you say you privilege it, can you elaborate on that?
Have you repeat your question?
Well,
when you say you privilege it, can you elaborate on that privileging?
It just means I prioritize this. I don't think that language and the theorists that I've read or the historian that I've read, you know, there might be something, you know, there are certain parts of David Stannard's book that, you know, that keep coming back into my head, and this will just rotate around with, you know, other things. And you know, by privileging, I just mean prioritizing. Yeah, like I try to put intuition and creative and visual, and for me, painting and drawing are, they're embodied practices that, that can be rethought into being radical and democratic, and thought of, for me, into care work. And so it's like thinking them and using them in a totally different way, but I only come to that understanding after 20 years of doing it. So I have to make my work before I can understand what I'm doing. And yeah, so that's what I do.
And, you know, could I just add, I don't know, you maybe weren't finished, Bob. Sorry. But when you've completed a work, or when you think you have, you think, oh, I think maybe that's it, you probably evaluate it. I mean, how are you judging whether you like this, whether it's successful for you?
Well, I mean, I have been trained in all the traditional components of, like, you know, I actually have a very traditional background in drawing and painting, so I learned certain technical skills that I was talking to one of the MFA students that they didn't learn this. They don't, and I think that's a real problem, and it's a real mistake. And so for me, that I know how to glaze in oil paints, and that this has transferred into how I am able to work on the skin of the, in building up the skin color in this work. All of, you know, there's a form of knowledge attached to painting and drawing, a tradition that is incredibly important, but it's like about how we use this. And so for me, I think that tradition has to be taught. It's incredibly important because it gives us another language. It's another language of resistance. It can be. And so we have to think about these mediums differently, I think, that they can be democratic because you don't need technology, you don't need anything, you need your hand. And so that is, for me, the radical and democratic part. It doesn't have to be elitist and hierarchical and, the painting is the most expensive art form in terms of luxury good production, but that isn't what it has to be. It's also a universal practice that everyone in the world has done and every culture has done. And so it has to be taken out of this context too, I think.
So it's her language is art. Her language is visual art. That's. I think I was trying to kind of sort of get what Bob was after. Yeah, go ahead.
Would you say ambiguity or specificity is a priority in the work?
How do you mean? About what? On what level?
I guess visually speaking, is ambiguity something that you would say is a priority?
I think a lot about, for me, a priority is how democratic image making. And I want my work to be accessible to a lot of people. And I think that for me, making these works in particular, We've Come a Long Way to Be Together, what is important to me about this project was that every part of my research was somehow embedded into the surface of this work, so that if you wanted to spend the time with the work, you could start to ask questions and formulate ideas based on what is there without reading anything external, without knowing me, without ever having done any research. And I had this experience in southern Germany at a small Kunsthalle where I showed 300 of these book pages behind me. And while I was installing, the cleaning woman from the museum would come in and talk to me about the work. And for me, this was this moment where I was and was really engaged with it. And in the small German Bavarian town, people were really engaged with this book, which deals with their history, but presented in a way that they allowed them to both acknowledge it, but not feel bad. And at the same time, to feel a lot of things. That was a moment that I realized I want my work accessible to the cleaning lady of the museum as well as the director of the museum. And this is important. And I think this is why I work with figuration and why I work with images of the body. And that is a priority to me. And I think because I work with figuration, there is a way that my work, that there has been a kind of dismissal of it as being naive, but it's this is from perspectives that I don't give a lot of weight to.
Well, we've gone over time. Yeah. So I think we're going to have to end it there. Thank you all so much. It was just really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.